My aunt's house is haunted. She has had things happen to her almost all her life. The paranormal activities usually center around her, but many of the family members, it's a big joint family, even guests, have had their fair share of encounters with whatever lives in their house. I've only visited their house during family functions or other festivities. Usually, it was a full house with lots of hustle and bustle, so I never had any first-hand experience there. However, I'd like to share some stories about it. This happened about 10 years ago. The bed in my aunt's room was pushed against a wall. She slept on the wall, while my uncle took the open side. Whenever she needed to use the bathroom at night, she'd have to cross her uncle's sleeping form to climb down the bed. Both of them were quite tall and large, so you can imagine the whole ordeal had a bit of fanfare to it. One night, my uncle woke up to my aunt slipping past him and climbing down the bed. The bed was shaking a little, and everything was shaking. It was dark, so he couldn't make out much, and he was ready to fall back asleep. Only, he remembered that my aunt wasn't even there to begin with. She'd come to visit our family and stayed with us for a couple of days. My uncle was sleeping alone in bed. As soon as he realized this, he quickly sat up in a panic and turned on the bedside lamp. There, in the middle of the room, he saw someone standing, their whole body covered in a thick layer of body hair that looked more like fur on a bear. And the entity, looked over their shoulder towards my uncle. They had the exact same face as my aunt. They smiled at my uncle, wearing my aunt's face, and then ran out of the room. Shaken to the core, my uncle gave chase. He had no idea what or who he was seeing. But when he made it to the living room, the thing was gone entirely. 2 months later, a maid who used to work for my aunt in the past came to visit them, exchanged some pleasantries, etc. They were all talking, and eventually, the fact that my uncle had seen a furry spirit came up in the conversation. Hearing the story, the maid started to shake in fear. She grabbed my aunt and confessed that she had also seen a similar thing when she was working for them. They have an outdoor kitchen and a conjoined area for washing and cleaning with a well. One night after a very late dinner, the maid washed all the dishes near the well. Every other family member had returned to their own rooms at that point. It was a cold night, and she was all alone. Suddenly she felt someone was there. When she looked over, she saw a figure covered in fur from shoulder to feet, but its face was exactly like my aunt's. She was so scared she ran back to the house. This was the whole reason she quit her job at their house. She never told anyone because she thought no one would believe her. This is the scariest thing I've ever heard, and it spooks me every time I remember. There's actually a third encounter with the same entity and the same site. So this is the third encounter with the third entity. This time the victim is my cousin. It happens almost 7 to 8 years after the last encounter. At this point, my uncle has sadly passed away due to an illness. So it's just my aunt, his son, her brother-in-law, and his family, wife, 2 kids, in the house. Bill had a night shift at work, so he asked my cousin, M, 22 years old at that time, to make sure all the doors were properly locked after he left for work. Around 11:30 p.m., my cousin came downstairs and started locking up. When he is locking up the front gate, 2 hands clutch at the railing from outside, covered in white fur. He doesn't get to see much, but he's sure it's all humanoid form standing outside, with only 2 forearms visible, resting on the railing right above his own hands, where he has it on the lock and key. He gets scared out of his mind. Aunt's SIL was inside putting her daughter to sleep when heard a loud scream. She thinks it's his son who snuck out of bed and is now making a ruckus. She comes out of the room intending to scold him, only to find my cousin cramped under the sofa in the living room. For most sofas, you know how little space it has between the floor and the bottom of it? Barely a few inches. Now imagine an entire 22-year-old grown man just stuck under it and shaking with fear, sweating and teeth chattering. It's not clear if he himself crawled under the sofa out of fear or not. But for the next 2 to 3 days, my cousin runs a high fever and is delirious most of the time. At the peak of his delirium, he tries to get up from bed and run outside multiple times, not listening to anyone, and has to be held down by force. Eventually, the fever breaks off and his mind clears out. But this is the last straw for my aunt, and she decides enough is enough. They can't go on like this anymore. So experts are consulted, and within the next few months, they exorcise the whole place. In our culture, it's called a binding, which is an invisible barrier along the periphery of the house, property, that doesn't allow anything non-human to cross inside the barrier. As far as I know, they haven't had any more disturbances or sightings since.